Dear viewers, I'm pretty sure you know what haiku are, these short poems from Japan. But have you ever heard the name of Matsuo Bashō, the poet who changed poetry forever? In this video I'm going to tell you about his life and his experiences from becoming a servant in the Yoshitada family to becoming one of the most influential poets of his time. So, Matsuo Bashō was born in the city of Ueno, which is in the province Iga, or today it's called Mie Prefecture, in 1644. His father was a minor samurai in the service of the so-called Todo family, and the son of this family was of about the same age as Basho. He was called Todo Yoshitada, and Basho was becoming a kind of servant but also companion in that family. And they were growing up together. Together they learned, for example, reading and writing, and they both shared a love for the poetry form of Haikai no Renga, which is a form of linked verse that is written together between different people. So one would compose the first poem and then the next person, the next one. And from that later, haiku emerged as its own poetry form and its own genre. But Todo Yoshitada, who became one of his dearest friends, died in 1666, when Basho was at the age of 22. He was devastated and he was actually asking to leave the service of the family, and after that he was moving to the city of Kyoto, which was still the cultural capital of Japan at the time. There he studied both Japanese and Chinese poetry and philosophy, and also learned about Zen Buddhism. In 1672 then, after spending several years in Kyoto, he decided to move to Edo, which is the old name of the capital of Tokyo these days. He slowly built a reputation in the urban poetry leagues, and he became famous quite quickly. He was publishing in several anthologies, and he was working on writing poetry for years and years to refine his craft. He was becoming so popular that he was invited to the most important literary circles of the time, and he also had several students under him who learned poetry writing, especially from Basho. He was inspiring his students a lot, and they were so happy about the teachings of their master that they built him a home, and they also gifted him a basho tree, a banana tree. He liked that tree so much that he decided to name himself after that tree. From Matsuo Munefusa, he was changing his name to Matsuo Bashō, the name that we know today. And in that hut he stayed for quite some time, but it was burning down in 1682 and still rebuilt by his disciples over and over again. So Basho was never really attached to physical things or to a certain place too much, but he was more of a wandering soul, and this is also why he embarked in so many different journeys. Before we learn about Basho and how he transformed haiku poetry, you got to learn some things about the origins of the poetry. Long before the haiku form of poetry, the poetry form of Waka was very popular in Japan. It was dominant among the aristocracy and was their poetry style, especially starting in the Heian period. And it was consisting of 31 syllables of 5-7-5-7-7. So you can already see the structure of the haiku with the 5-7-5 syllables that was developed later. But this Waka poetry was used primarily for refined nature descriptions and to express deep emotions, and used by courtiers mainly for playful and witty conversations by splitting the poem into two parts, One of them would be the 5-7-5 opening and then a 7-7 response, often by someone else. So this is how you get into the poetic conversation. After that, the linked verse Renga developed. It could also be seen as a consequence because the practice of Waka evolved into Renga. It just translates to linked verse, and it means that multiple poets together compose poetry. And this could become very long sequences, up to 100 poems. So you can imagine that it's like a whole collection, not only just a few poems. And this is also where the 5-7-5 structure first became visible as a distinct unit. There is one example that I want to present to you to see how this witty kind of conversation happens. It goes like this. The horse grazing on the bank seems to me black in color. And the answer is, I think it otherwise, for its reflection in the paddy says chestnut brown. This is just one example saying there's just like a observation and then someone else comments on it and makes like a witty pun. Renga then split into two different schools. One of them was the serious school, the Ushin, and the other one, the non-serious, the Mushin. So the Ushin, the serious one, tried to emulate an elegant and refined style of the classical court poetry, while the non-serious one, the Mushin, tried to maintain this witty and playful but lower order tone. Only in the 15th century, this form of the hokku of the 5-7-5 syllable structure as a distinct unit was slowly developing, and it was seen as the highest form of poetry, only practiced by the most experienced poets. There were two rules that are still essential today. One of them was a kigo, a mandatory reference to the current season, so you know when the poem was written or what it was referring to. The other one, a kiriji, a breaking word or cutting word that was short and emotionally charged and expressed the flow of the poem to prove dignity and strength. And later, poets like the famous poet Soin and his disciples insisted that the real merit of the poetry was a metaphor. That is, saying one thing and meaning another. This idea was later even adopted by Basho when he developed his idea of a theory of substance and essence in poetry that I won't go into detail. The interpretation that Soa and his disciples made of the metaphor was just that two things from different fields would be brought together, things from different categories, and this could also be used for poking fun. And therefore the language also became vulgar sometimes, because the popular style that was developed in the haiku or hokku was slowly degenerating into this vulgar style. And it also lacked depth. There's one example that I want to read to you, saying, shush, shush, my wife encourages the baby to pass the water, and I hear the noise of a morning shower. So this is one example of how this form of the haiku was slowly becoming more vulgar and only used for funny expressions and not so much for deep emotions and experiences. But Basho's influence then was even greater because of that, because he saw that there was a lot of potential in haiku, and he was combining two sides, if you will, from his masters, the people that he learned from and also that had formed the haiku poetry before. One of them was the poet Sogi, the other one Soin. So Sogi stands for more seriousness and elegance of the classical masters, whereas Soin stands for the freedom and the energy of the modern and playful poetry schools. And Basho was able to combine both. So it's both free and energetic, but also serious and elegant in its expression. And this is how Basho transformed haiku into something more serious. You can see that in the next example that I will give you, where he is creating the very famous frog haiku that we know until today, and that is the poem that is referenced most, I think. And here you can see how his craft develops and also how it is different from what I've read to you before. In 1686, two anthologies were published: Kawazu Awase, The Frog Contest, and Haru no Hi, A Spring Day. The former is a collection of poems on frogs by Basho and his disciples. The latter is traditionally counted as the second of the major anthologies, though there are only 3 poems of Basho in it. But the importance of the anthologies, as you might have guessed, lies in one specific haiku, the frog haiku, that is quoted oftentimes until today. It goes like this: Furu ike ya kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto. In English, breaking the silence of an ancient pond, a frog jumped into the water, a deep resonance. Basho wrote this haiku together with his disciples, and one of his disciples suggested another kind of start. Instead of breaking the silence of an ancient pond, he suggested it could go like, amidst the flowers of the yellow rose. But Basho thought about it for a while and then decided for his own variant. He wanted to make poetry perfectly objective, to achieve a symbolic quality where the poet and the object become one. And this is what he achieved very well in this poem, because although it's so simple, it still has such a strong resonance and is so expressive, and you can find yourself immediately in the scene if you read it. And that's quite a strength of him. And I wanted to read a quote to you by Basho himself, where he teaches how to get into that state of mind that you would need to write such a kind of poetry. He says, "Go to the pine if you want to learn about the pine, or to the bamboo if you want to learn about the bamboo. And in doing so, you must leave your subjective preoccupation with yourself. Otherwise, you impose yourself on the object and do not learn. Your poetry issues of its own accord when you and the object have become one, when you have plunged deep enough into the object to see something like a hidden glimmering there. However well phrased your poetry may be, if your feeling is not natural, if the object and yourself are separate, then your poetry is not true poetry, but merely your subjective counterfeit." And I think that is very, very beautiful to see how you and the object have to become one, and then you can express that in poetry. So from this time on, 1686, this poem served as kind of the gold standard, and even before, Basho was very famous and had a lot of pupils that he was teaching poetry to. But from then on, I think his popularity grew even more. And until now, if you think of haiku, I think the first thing that comes to mind is this poem and also the name of Basho. So in the year 1684, Basho embarked on a journey that he later wrote down in the work, The Records of a Weather-Exposed Skeleton. And here he explored the genre of haibun for the first time. It can be debated whether he was the inventor of this genre or whether he was just calling it haibun as the first person. I don't really know, but he was definitely one of the most famous and important haibun writers, not only of this time, but until today. Haibun is a mixture of prose and poetry, or to be precise, of haiku and prose. Haibun is a seamless blend of prose and haiku. And when reading his work, you will be able to experience that, the way how they blend together so beautifully yourself. Basho realized that prose could provide the context and the narrative tension for the work, while the haiku acted as the kind of resolution or the emotional spark. So haiku could capture the beauty of the moment, whereas the prose writing around that could give a more of a context and also a story of how this haiku came about and why it was written, but not in a dull and dry way of just telling, I have been traveling there and I did that and then I wrote this haiku, but exploring the emotion and the thoughts that actually came up along that way. And this is what Basho explores with in the next few years, leading up to his most famous work, the Oku no Hosomichi, or the Narrow Road to the Deep North, which became his longest and most famous travelogue, which also contains some of his most famous haiku. So you can keep in mind that the haibun was a form of genre hybrid in a way that was maybe not invented by Basho, but definitely formed and changed by him, and therefore is still connected until this day with his name. Now you've learned how haiku developed from waka to renga to haiku in Japanese literary history, and the influence that Basho had on that. And you also learned about the form of haibun as a own genre between prose and poetry. Basho was not only working on his own poetry and teaching that poetry to others, but he was also deeply interested in traveling. And so he set out several journeys that he also wrote down in travel sketches especially. So the form of the haibun was used pretty often by haiku, not only in his most famous work, the Oku no Hosomichi, or the Narrow Road to the Deep North, but before also, for example, in a journey that he made between 1684 and 85 that he wrote down in the records of a weather-exposed skeleton, then also a visit to Karashima Shrine in 1687, and a travel that he made to the Yoshino Mountains in between 1687 and 1688. But his most influential journey and also the most profound and changing journey for him was the travel to the deep north of Japan, the Oku no Hosomichi. And if you want to learn about this travel, what he experienced there, and the poetry he wrote, and how this changed him, and the lessons we can learn from that, you should tune in to my next video that will be published very soon. I will talk about the Narrow Road to the Deep North and everything connected to it, all the background information you need, and everything that makes reading this absolutely wonderful work even more worthwhile for you. So if you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and also giving the video a thumbs up. That would make me very happy. Please leave a comment with your favorite haiku poem if you want, or write one yourself. And let me know whether you like Basho's poetry or whether you prefer another poet. And if you have written poetry like haiku yourself, I would be really interested to learn about that, because I have tried and I found it surprisingly easy, but it's not in the typical Japanese way. But for now, let's get this video to a close, and I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something from it. And I look forward to see you in my next video. Thank you and bye bye.